Hello everyone, this is Emberlight. Emberlight is due out in a couple of weeks, and it is a turn-based dungeon crawler that has a couple of really interesting ideas, which is what sort of actually caught my eye in the first place and made me want to actually try it out. And the main thing that you probably think of when it comes to dungeon crawlers is exploring and collecting loot. You know, you go around and you get some gear for your characters to make them stronger, to get to harder areas, to get better gear. That's just how the loop sort of works in dungeon crawlers. But in this case, they've decided to take a somewhat different route. So in Emberlight, there actually is no gear. There's no loot in the standard sense. Your characters do still start weak, but there's no gear that you go and equip them with. However, if you've ever played any game with blue magic in it, like a Final Fantasy with blue magic or anything like that, the idea that you can learn enemy abilities, certain enemy abilities you use, that's basically how this game works entirely. Like the actual main gear sort of replacement, as well as how to increase the strength of your characters in general, has to do with actually learning abilities from enemies, which is pretty cool because I've always loved that sort of thing. I think it adds a kind of a unique collection sort of aspect to an RPG, to actually go around and see what sorts of things that enemies can use that you can learn and try and get them all. But in this case, it seems that you can pretty much learn almost any ability that an enemy can use, and that's actually the main way to make yourself stronger. So when you're in combat, you'll see this little bar in the top right there that represents abilities that enemies have used this combat that your characters have observed and learned. You don't get them at first, you have to complete the combat first. But there's like a chance-based system, as there usually is with things like this. I believe it's like a 50% chance to learn the skill the first time an enemy uses it. Then the second time they use it in the same combat, it goes up to 75%, I believe. And then the third time and after, it's like a 100% chance. So that can be a reason, for instance, to draw out the combat a little bit. If this particular enemy has a certain skill that you really want, they just haven't used it yet or you haven't learned it yet, you can just, defend and just hit them a little bit and things like that to try and make the combat go a little bit longer so that you can learn that skill. And once the combat has finished, at that point you'll get a certain amount of gold and potions, and then you'll be able to learn the skills that your characters observed during the fight. And you can actually give any skill to any character. You just drag them to their skill bars and then they learn it. You have 3 characters at once in a given adventure. And the blue magic sort of, the enemy skills not only have their own things that they do, but they also have stats and a power level. So you'll see that on the skills there is the name of the skill and then a number after it, which is the sort of strength level of that skill, and the higher that goes, the stronger the skill is in various ways. Maybe its duration will go up, maybe it will have like a better sort of equation that it uses based on the potency stat of your characters in terms of how much damage it does, things like that. It just means that it gets better. And you can find sometimes that you'll fight an enemy that you fought earlier and it will use the same skill, but it will use it at a much higher power level, so you'll be able to learn it again and sort of replace one of your character's skills with it, or just have 2 characters with the same skill. And they also will have a stat that they give. So I guess that's sort of the replacement for gear. If you think about it, the skills themselves actually do give you stats like extra accuracy, extra health, extra potency, which is sort of the main damage determining stat for all skills. So that means that learning these skills is not only important for just having more things to use as a character, but also it's important because they're the replacement for gear. They're how you get your characters stronger and up their stats and all that stuff. So that makes it pretty interesting already, because that's very unusual, the idea that you can learn pretty much any skill. And that also gives you a reason to explore and fight things like mini-bosses and bosses, because you can learn their skills too. So obviously things like that, those harder enemies will have much more powerful skills for you to learn, often things exclusive to them. And there's also a trait system where once you have a certain number of certain types of skills on a single character, they will earn a trait. So for instance, if you have 5 arcane skills, which are usually like spells and magic-based stuff, on one character they'll get the arcane mastery trait, which ups the potency, the overall damage of any skill with the arcane tag on it. And they work like that for all the various types of skills that you can find. And there are also, interestingly enough, boss traits where once you kill a boss, all of your characters that are alive will gain a certain passive trait, and these can be very, very powerful. For instance, just as a basic one, there's a centaur boss you can face on the first floor, and if you beat them, you will get the fleet-footed trait, which ups everyone's speed, so they get their turns faster, which is really, really useful. And every boss has one of those traits, and that sort of is another interesting aspect of the game, because it sort of relies on building a run, if that makes sense, where instead of just instead of going into a run and having each floor have a sort of like pseudo-random boss, like a sort of pool of several bosses that it will randomly choose from, like a lot of sort of roguelites do it, in this case you actually choose the boss that you're going to go for, and you choose what level you're going to go down to. So there's like the surface, and then there are caves below that, and then there are like these dungeons below that, and it keeps going all the way down to like the 5th level of stuff, but you have to unlock those. And as you go farther down, you will have to, still beat the boss of the previous floor that you've chosen, and then you'll go down to the next one to get to the next boss, and just keep doing that until you reach the one that you have selected to go down to for that adventure. So that is a way that you can kind of choose the length of the adventure. If you only want it to be one floor just on the surface, you can choose the surface boss and end it there. Or if you want to, say, delve down to the 2nd floor and maybe fight the golem, then you can choose the first boss that you'll fight and choose the golem as the 2nd floor, and you'll go to both of them. So this creates a sort of situation where you're trying to build a run based on the characters you want to take, the kind of skills that you're going to get, and the traits that the bosses give you. And you'll know, of course, once you've fought the boss, at least once, you'll know which traits they give you, so you can sort of build what you think is more advantageous to face the further challenges and still survive, which is a really neat way to do things, because that whole like knowing what you're going to face beforehand and sort of building an adventure almost like Dungeons and Dragons style sort of is really neat, and not enough games actually take that sort of route. I think it's a pretty cool way to do things. Now, the other big mechanic that actually caught my eye is the corruption mechanic in the game. So you'll notice in combat, your characters actually have 3 gauges above their heads, the first one obviously being health, but the other 2 are a bit different. Now, there is no mana or stamina or anything like that. None of the gauges work like that. The abilities are based solely on a sort of cooldown basis. All skills have cooldowns, no mana costs or anything. The second bar is actually a rage bar, which is, you could consider it kind of like a limit break sort of thing. There are specific rage abilities. They will have the word rage in the tags, and also the text of the ability name will be in red, which is just a way to tell you that it's an ability that uses the rage bar. They're, like I said, basically like limit breaks, and they're things that are very, very powerful, but you have to build up this gauge to use. None of the classes start with one of them. I'm not sure. There are other unlockable classes. There are 3 that you start with, and there are 9 total. There are sort of 3 in each kind of archetype, like your tanky characters, your fast stabby characters, and your magey characters, basically. And none of them start with a rage ability. I'm not sure if the later unlockable classes do, but they're things that you can get. And that is mostly because of the 3rd bar that you'll see, which is actually black, although it's kind of hard to tell because it's not filled up too much. And that is the corruption bar. So the whole theme of the game is that your characters are going into this impossible situation, facing horrible evils, and corrupting themselves to actually get strong enough to continue facing the more horrible evils. And that actually is what happens every time you take an enemy ability. It ups that corruption bar. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you how much. It tells you in the bottom left in like the log, once a character takes an ability, how much it raises the bar, but it doesn't tell you beforehand. Like the ability itself doesn't say corruption blank. So you just have to kind of figure it out as you go. I feel like that could be changed. It might be helpful. But and the corruption mechanic is such that every 25% of that bar, a corruption trait is actually attained. Your characters will laugh evilly, and they'll get a trait. And the first time they do it, that will determine what creature they are going to corrupt into. There are things like a lich, a demon, and several other things that involve your characters basically turning evil as you actually play. And that's really neat to me. They're technically good traits, but they can add difficulty. There are traits like the Lich, for instance, which will actually decrease their health but up their potency a lot, and then eventually, once they get their corruption meter up to max, they'll turn full Lich, and at that point, healing abilities will actually hurt them instead, since they're undead. So these are often traits that you have to build yourself around, and as your characters get corruption, which they inevitably will, because you need to use these abilities to get stronger, they will offer another kind of, another hurdle for you to build around in terms of what you want them to be and what you want them to do, because, of course, these traits will change how the abilities might work or make them better at using certain things and stuff like that. So that's a really cool mechanic, and it actually doesn't stop there, because once you are done, once you have beaten the, I guess you could say, the final boss, the boss that you've chosen to stop at, the game is not actually over. There's one more battle, and it's against your characters. Your characters will sort of become corrupted completely, although that does not max the gauge out. That's just like the sort of corruption taking hold. And you will then take control of the most corrupted one, the one with the highest corruption meter, and you will try and kill the others. And this is actually a battle that you cannot lose, because it ends whenever there's one of your characters left, so at some point you'll basically be finished no matter what. And the idea is to just kill your other teammates, because you're all evil now. And if the one that you're playing as dies, you'll move to the next most corrupted until finally there's only one person left. And that person will then become a boss of a future run, because they have been corrupted and turned evil. That's really neat. That's a very cool mechanic, and I think it's really, really interesting. And again, it kind of adds to the whole Dungeons and Dragons like feel of the game, because you're sort of building this adventure, and then by the end of it, something horrible goes wrong. There's only one character left, and it's left to the next band of characters to actually figure out what happened and to face them later. That's really cool, and I definitely like the idea. And of course, that final battle can be pretty tricky because every character will have the strength and the abilities that you yourself gave them to use against you and against each other. So that makes the final battle pretty interesting, to say the least, and that adds an interesting theme of sort of, I guess you could say it's like a dark fantasy kind of idea, because this like inevitable hurtling towards your own doom kind of feeling is sort of fun. You know, you're building to become very, very strong, knowing that eventually you will have to actually face each other. So that's mostly how Emberlight works, and it does have a persistent unlock system, like I mentioned, that allows you to fight more and more bosses and go deeper as you go, and also unlock things like new event and room types, as well as new classes later on. So there's quite a bit to do. It's a pretty interesting concept. There are a couple of problems I have, I will say, which is, you know, it's out in a few weeks, so you might as well actually mention various things that you think should be fixed, or at least that may be fixed. For one, I would say that the interface is not as responsive as it should be, in my opinion. Things like clicking enemies to target them is difficult sometimes, because you can click them like 6 or 7 times, and occasionally it does not want to target them, and there is no auto-target. You have to click an enemy every time an enemy dies, or every time you want to use an ability. So if that is less responsive, it makes it feel more sluggish than it needs to be, basically. And the same goes with moving around the map. You click the doorways to move to new rooms, but the doorways are not as responsive as they should be, and sometimes you have to click them like upwards of 8 times I've had before it actually decides to move you, which is weird. And sometimes the outline doesn't work correctly. It like has an outline when you hover over it to show that it's an interactable object, but sometimes it just shows up on its own even when you're hovering over something else, or it doesn't show up at all, yet you can still click it. So that kind of interface bugginess or sort of unresponsiveness, I think, could be fixed, because it's not like a huge game-breaking balance issue or anything. It's just that the interface overall is not exactly a fan of clicking sometimes. And the other thing that I have maybe a bit of a problem with, it makes me wonder how much variety the classes have, because right now the main difference between the classes is how much health they start with, because there's only one stat for determining the power of your abilities, which is potency, which every character has. So it's not like there are characters really good at using magic or characters really good at using stealthy abilities or whatever. Everyone can use any ability. And that makes me wonder what these other classes you can unlock are, and if they're actually worth working towards to unlock, because how much more individual can they be right now when pretty much every class can do the same thing no matter what. I feel like maybe that could be diversified somehow, but that is kind of a large balancing thing to do as well, so we'll see how that all works. The game itself is out in a couple of weeks, as I mentioned, on August 13th is when this comes out, and it will be available for $15, which I think is a very fair price for what it offers. A pretty unique dungeon crawl experience that has, you know, really good turn-based combat, a lot of tactical decision-making because of the various things that you're going to be building your characters into, and that whole corruption mechanic being really pretty unique, and the idea of like every ability being learnable, blue magic style, is really cool. And I think that makes it something to keep an eye on, because it's a pretty unique take on the dungeon crawl sort of idea that we see all the time, and is usually pretty fun, but it's always cool to see people do it in a bit of a different way. And that is exactly what Emberlight is. So thank you guys very, very much for watching. If you would like to check this game out or wishlist it before it comes out, things like that, it will be, as always, in the description below this video, the link to the Steam page and a bit.ly link to make it better looking. And that has been Emberlight. So thank you guys again very, very much for watching. And do check it out. Do keep an eye on it if you like it. And like I said, wishlisting actually does help developers quite a lot. So if you do find this interesting, if you find it something that might be worth your attention, do wishlist it just to keep an eye on it, and because, you know, it's helpful for like very small indie guys and things especially. So there you guys go. I'll see you guys next time.